Okay, and hello everybody, and welcome to part two of episode 34 of This Week in FCPA. Moving right along, let's talk about a compliance defense. First of all, I was a little surprised when that question was raised to several people today that they didn't seem to really be aware of the issue. One person said, they would love it. It would lead to more compliance. Another person said that kind of clarity would be good. Now, I've come out very strongly against a compliance defense. And let me ask this, based on what we heard this morning, should I rethink? Am I wrong?
Let me just answer that by see if I can verify the phrase. Odell Guyton, I believe,
right,
the Chief Compliance Officer from Microsoft. And his thoughts on a compliance defense were along the lines of the following. If you've been indicted by, or the government brings an enforcement action based upon a criminal violation of the FCPA, that means the department's gone before the grand jury. The grand jury has found probable cause that a crime has been committed, and you are now indicted. And at that point, you're going to be a corporation in front of a jury saying we have an adequate compliance defense. And his point was that no U.S. corporation would ever want to be in that position. And so it's a long-winded way of saying a very short answer, which is no, nine, yet, never, nil, the nil set, whatever it may be. Because the thing that is the most significant to me is no company will ever use a compliance defense at trial because no company will ever go to trial. They cannot afford to. He sat up there and said, representing Microsoft, we cannot afford to. We will not afford to. No board of directors would allow it to get that far. There will be a negotiation with the department. There's some credit given for a compliance defense. I wish his point in responding to that further was he wished there was some greater clarity about what he might receive in terms of credit for a compliance defense. But as far as having an affirmative compliance defense, he basically indicated that would be meaningless and useless for his corporation.
So let me ask this though, granted, as an affirmative defense, it's useless, okay? Because no company, you're right, no company is going to get to the point where they can actually assert the compliance defense. But do you think that it would allow companies greater leverage in their negotiations with the department if the compliance defense were readily available and they could point to it and say, in your decision whether or not and to what extent to prosecute us, one of the things you should take into consideration is the availability to us of this absolute defense to a violation because we have an effective compliance program.
Leverage only exists if you're willing to use it. And if you're not ever willing to go to trial, it's not leverage. It's a discussion point, perhaps. But as to leverage with the department, I find that equally meaningless and useless because you're not going to go to trial. You can have a very good best practices compliance program. You can have something based on adequate procedures. It may all be very good, and it will all be very good. It's designed to do a couple things. One is prevent, to the extent possible, and then a violation or detect a violation, and then remediate or lessen the penalty. You will get some credit for it with the department, but I can't tell you what that credit is, nor probably can anyone else, because it's going to be based on the facts and circumstances of your program and the violation you had. And did your program really prevent? It certainly didn't prevent it, but did it detect it, or was it reasonable based upon the circumstances? And to have an absolute affirmative defense, first of all, it will never cover every situation. But the bottom line is no corporation will ever use it, so why have it in there?
So, I can hear the point. I mean, my worry actually is it would actually reduce leverage in a negotiation because right now the department is required to take that into account. If they turn it into an affirmative defense, I could envision in particularly contentious negotiations where the department says, if you think you have an effective compliance defense, if you think you have an effective compliance program, prove it up at trial, and we're done. You're not going to get. I'm not going to take that into account because if you want to use it at trial. I don't know that they would do that, but I could envision in these harsh negotiations, certainly as a negotiation stance, of the department then taking that position. Now, I like to think that the Department of Justice, lawyers, and the fraud department are reasonable people, and they're not looking to just punish corporations. They're looking to punish wrongdoing, and to the extent that a company has a truly effective compliance program, I think that is taken into account. I think that we have seen we have knowledge of, though not information on, declinations that the department does decline to prosecute. This is something that we've spoken about that I think is wrongheaded, and I actually agree with Professor Kaler that they should release information on declinations to add that kind of clarity. But the department already takes this stuff into account. I think that just having it to have it when nobody's going to use it, I don't really see the point of. But let me ask this, because one of the things that Professor Kaler advocates is, instead of making it an affirmative defense, to make it an element of the crime that the department would have to prove the negative on. And certainly that would turn it from a thing that the corporation could never use into an actual analysis by the corporation and a required analysis by the DOJ of whether or not a crime actually occurred. What do you think?
First of all, I think that would probably be the worst of all worlds, because then you really would have less compliance, because companies would try to stand behind the shield, which, if not completely porous, is probably non-existent. But you brought up an interesting point I hadn't thought of in terms of the procedural aspects of how you get to trial. If you're in a negotiation with the department prior to an indictment and you don't resolve the issue, the department says, fine, we'll indict you, and that's going to be enough. Your stock is going to tank. You're going to have 55 shareholder lawsuits filed within 36 hours, and the negative effects from that indictment alone are going to be enough. So if a company, if it is a contentious negotiation, I just realized the government could just indict and not go to trial and settle, post-indictment.
And it's funny, because I don't think it's a coincidence. Now, I can't say for certain that there's a causation factor here, but I don't think it's a coincidence that after the Department of Justice made noises about presenting Avon to the grand jury, that Avon's bonds were downgraded.
Yes.
I don't think that's a coincidence. I think that's exactly right. That information getting into the market about a potential indictment of a public company affects the standing of that company, both the stock price, the potential shareholder derivative actions, and the the bond rating of the company. I could also, the reason I don't like it as an element, though I do think that having it as an element of the crime would solve the ineffective nature of an affirmative defense. Okay? I think it would solve that problem, because it would provide real leverage. I think it would have two follow-on effects that I don't like. The first is, it would open up as a legitimate avenue of the government's investigation, not just legitimate, but mandatory avenue of the government's investigation, the true deep implementation of your compliance program. They would be rooting around with a stick in your compliance program to find whether or not you truly did implement. Right now, you come in and present, and they might ask questions, they might push, but it's going to be nothing.
Right.
Like if they actually have to investigate and prove up that your compliance program is ineffective. I think that they would find a lot more stuff that you've done wrong, because they're rooting around, and if they uncover something, they're going to prosecute that too. So I think you'd find that, and I think that you don't want that. So people think that they want it as an element, but the government's going to be vastly expanding its investigation into every aspect of your compliance program, because they need to prove that you stink at it.
Right.
And I don't know that companies are going to want that. So I also see it as I think that's probably the biggest problem that with it as an element of the offense. Besides the fact that I don't know that you can force the government to prove up a negative as an element. I think that's a kind of a tough burden to place on them. So we'll see. We'll see how that goes. I don't think it's going to happen. A compliance defense.
Right.
Because I think Ashley Watson today said it best. The atmosphere is just not such that you can lighten up on corporate, responsibility for misconduct and have it pass, in Congress.
Certainly not in this Congress.
That's exactly right.
This year.
So okay, that's the compliance defense. Let me set up part 3.